Yeah, so I have
Let's gather back up again for our next presentation. So please work your way back to your tables. Thank you.
I thought it was not that. I didn't think about looking at that until late. Oh, I forgot.
Sure. Yeah, I'll send that over there, probably this evening. I think that's gonna be a 1 page or about tax on everything. Glad you came out. Yeah, I know.
She wants to. Okay, let's get back to our seats and for our next presentation. Yeah. We're getting inundated with so much information.
Nathan?
My brain can't handle it all. I'm sure the rest of you can handle it, but at any rate, we talked a lot about property tax. We've been talking about that for a while. That became a very important issue when we had our annual meeting in July. And so I immediately called a friend of mine who is, I met while I was in the legislature, is probably the most knowledgeable person in the state of Kansas about budget, property tax and taxes in general. And I asked him to come here. He said, I can't do it. He said, I'm overbooked, but I can give you a name. And when he gave me that name, I knew this is somebody to listen to talking about because he learned under the master. So the person we have speaking today is Nathan Kessler, who is a principal economist at Kansas Action for Children. He has a bachelor's and a master's degree in economics from Emporia State University and worked in the Department of Labor as a labor economist. In his role at Kansas Action for Children, he's primarily responsible for the organization's work on state tax policy, but also leverages his expertise to produce publications covering a wide range of economic issues. But something that I'm really proud of Nathan is that he's a graduate of Independence High School. I happened to be privileged to be superintendent of schools in Independence during the time he was there. And I always loved to see kids who graduated doing something important. So I give you Nathan Kessler.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me here to talk about what I'm told is one of your favorite subjects. No side that favoritism is, but hopefully today you'll get something of value out of some information I've brought for you here today, and I'll be around tomorrow as well to provide some testimony on property taxes. There may be a little bit of additional content there. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started, and I do have
Get
a
that.
nice slideshow for you. I think it's nice anyway. And it's actually from a series we have. That's why it says tax policy education. We do income, all that sort of stuff. So as was said, I'm Nathan Kessler. I'm the principal economist at Kansas Action for Children. I work on a variety of issues, but taxes is pretty much my bread and butter there. Today, we're going to talk about a few different things. We're going to pretty much start with a holistic overview of what property taxes are, who pays, who benefits, just sort of just a general overview. And then we're going to get into some of the different methods by which states have tried to offer property tax relief. Some good, some not so good. And so we'll get into some of the fun stuff towards the end, but I've got to drag you through the mud first. Okay, so first we're going to start with some terminology, and that is going to be appraised value, assessed value, mill levy, and ad valorem tax. Now, the appraised value is just the market value of a home, the standard value that you would think if you were going to sell or purchase a home. The assessed value is a little bit more complicated. So that is the taxable value of the property, which is gotten to by taking the appraised value times 11.5%. And now just to make it a little bit more complicated for you, when it comes to the 20 mills that the state levies, that's actually your appraised value minus the first $75,000, and then 11.5% of that. So it's no wonder that people hate this whole system. Mill levy is just the unit by which property is taxed. 1 mill is equal to 1/10 of a penny. And finally, an ad valorem tax is a tax levied according to the value, in this case, the home's value, as opposed to something levied per unit, like with a pack of cigarettes or something like that. Now, property taxes are a critical source of revenue for local governments. And as much as none of us like them, we do have to pay them. They're here to stay, most likely. Because local governments are unable to raise money in the ways that the states can, states can levy income taxes, they can do all sorts of different things to sort of stimulate revenue, but local governments just don't have that option. So they rely on property taxes and, to a lesser extent, sales taxes in order to provide all the services that they do. So this right here is a property tax bill. It's my property tax bill. And in Shawnee County, anybody can just go online and look these up, and you can get a sense of sort of who you're paying property taxes to and how much you're paying to that entity. I'm sure in many of your counties, they have a similar thing. I doubt all counties do. I'm sure that this isn't costless to run. But if we look at this, you can see here that the school district, county, and the city represent the lion's share of these taxes. So with the city, it's kind of blurry up there, so I'll sort of just break this down for you a little bit. The city of Topeka levies about 36 mills, about 37, and in my case, that came up about $323. The county levies about 48 mills, another $425, and the school district, US 501, levied an additional 44.5 mills, and that was another $292. And then there are a few miscellaneous taxes on there that, also add up to the full bill. Every non-exempt property in the county pays these taxes. So, while some of these are smaller, some of them are quite large, and that has a huge impact on homeowners, especially fixed income seniors.
The next one.
All right. So while you didn't see it on the previous slide, the state government levies a 20 mil levy. This is used to fund schools in Kansas, or partially. Of course, the schools themselves also levy their own option, their local option budgets, what that's called. And you didn't see that on the previous slide. One, because it's actually wrapped up in the school finance or the school levies. So where it's at 44 for USD 501, 20 of those were actually the statewide mill levy. The statewide mill levy came about from the 1992 school finance law. This essentially standardized property taxes for school finance across the state. previously, property taxes for school finance were all over the place, one example is that. Burlington, New Strong area had a really low property tax because they had the nuclear power plant, whereas other areas were just exorbitantly high. So this law sort of leveled that playing field and required all non-exempt properties sort of have some skin in the game on public schools. It wasn't always 20 mils and has declined over time, but that's where it stands now. And interestingly enough, this mill levy is actually not permanently in statute. It has to be renewed every 10 years. Previously, the courts had determined that the only permanent levy that the state could issue was the 1.5 mils for state and educational and institutional building funds. This last year, the Kansas legislature is eliminating that 1.5 mils, and that will be effective next tax year. So still on there this year, I'm sorry to say. I mean, I'd be just as happy to have that $20 this year as next year. Right. Slide, please. Okay, so as I said, the bulk of the property taxes are paid to local governments. These taxes vary significantly across different communities based on the size and value of the tax base there. So, for example, I mentioned Burlington, New Strong area with the Wolf Creek Power Plant. Because that plant pays so much in property taxes, the residents end up paying a little bit less. And because of the smaller tax base, they could probably be paying even less if there were more people there. But the revenue raised at the local level is important no matter where you're at or who's paying it, because it's used to provide services and infrastructure that we all use. So we think about public schools, roads, police, fire services, everything that we need is provided as a public good thanks to property taxes. And there are several other entities that rely on property taxes for funding, and then primarily public schools, as we saw in that one example, but also things like your local library or the public universities in an area. So Washburn, Emporia State, K-State, KU, Pittsburgh State, all of these universities rely on public money. These services provide people with education, transportation, internet, all these things that we need that would not be a public good were it not for property tax. Instead, we would have toll roads and we would have privatized police. So it is really an important source of revenue at the local level. Now, as for who pays, that's virtually everybody. I don't think I have to tell all of you. And many of us pay it directly for our homes, businesses, land, or even our vehicles. All of that is subject to property taxes. But even renters indirectly pay property taxes on their home, as those taxes are often factored into the rent prices. So we're all pretty much on the hook for this. There are several exempt entities, which we are going to get to, but I would bet you the people who work at those exempt entities pay some property taxes in some form or another. So as for those exempted entities, primarily the ones that come to mind right off the top of the head are government and religious institutions. These organizations are exempt from property taxes. While they don't pay them, it can get pretty complicated though, honestly, right? So while a church may not pay property taxes, some organization that it owns might. So this is really a very complicated system that we're all just trying to navigate, including those exempt entities. Other ones that are included in this are public schools and universities and certain nonprofits. So this is the nonprofits, again, another one where it gets kind of complicated. So nonprofits that operate primarily as charities, education, or religious institutions don't pay property taxes, but then organizations like my own probably do if we own any property we rent. So I guess we get those indirect taxes, right? Now we get to the who benefits. I've been sort of harping on these services this whole time, and I'm going to go ahead and do it one more time, just for everybody's benefit. The services funded by property taxes are generally enjoyed by everybody. That's roads, bridges, parks, schools, police and fire services, and even elections are all made possible because of property taxes. If that money were to dry up, then those services would likely dry up for those that are not able to independently pay. So you sort of, you can start to see that property taxes are almost a form of investment in one's community. That doesn't mean that paying them is fun. While the services property taxes fund are important, that doesn't mean we want to pay, but we want those services, right? So the challenge then becomes balancing, having those services and not overpaying for them, which I think sometimes we all get the sense that we're stuck doing. And this is not a new feeling, actually. This particular political cartoon is actually from the 1970s, when there was a major property tax revolt as a result of standardizing valuations and tax systems. So the key that I want you to take away from this slide is that we've been dealing with this for a long time, and that knee-jerk reactions should really be avoided. Lawmakers should really focus on targeted, sustainable relief and broadening that tax base. All right, so we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about a few states that have addressed property tax concerns using different methods, and hopefully we can learn a little something from them. Okay, so tax and expenditure limitation, also known as TELS, which I might be using over the rest of this conversation, and I don't mean my poker face. So these tax expenditure limitations are restrictions on growth in government spending and or revenue. Some focus on just one side, some focus on both. We're going to see a little bit of both of those sides. Several of these were introduced in the 70s after the valuation and taxing systems were standardized. And these can be effective for preventing tax increases, no doubt. But ultimately, they can put states in challenging situations. The first tax and expenditure limitation we're going to talk about is known as Proposition 13. Has anybody here heard of Proposition 13?
California?
Yep, California, that's right. Yep, we're going to start there. Proposition 13 is an assessment. It essentially restricts valuation increases, so that assessed valuation specifically, restricts that to 2% annually, except in the case of a transfer of ownership of that property. This is one of those TELs that is a product of the 1970s property tax revolt and was implemented through voter initiative in I believe it was the late 70s. This measure has been highly distortionary and has led to some pain in the California housing market. Currently, they have a home ownership rate of about 55.3%. So it's extraordinarily low. In Kansas, it's much higher, around 67%. So while it was initially intended to be a good thing, too much of a good thing can be bad. And we're going to see why on this next slide. This is an example, and maybe not so extreme considering, housing prices in California, but this is an example of 3 homes owned by Warren Buffett. And it perfectly illustrates the pitfalls of measures like Proposition 13. So what we see here is that Mr. Buffett had bought a home with a market value of $4 million in 2003. He bought the home in the early 70s. He has another property just adjacent to that one, same exact neighborhood. You can see it from the window of either one, you can see the other. And it has a market value half that of the first one, but it was bought in the mid-1990s. And so when we look at that, despite having half the market value, Warren Buffett paid nearly 6 times the amount of property taxes on that home he bought in the 90s. And that was simply because of when he bought the home. The one he owned in the 70s, all the way up through 2003, the assessed valuation had been arbitrarily kept low. Whereas when he purchased the one in the 90s, there was a reevaluation, a reassessment, and now all of a sudden he owes a boatload of money in tax. Well, not a boatload for him, but he owes a whole lot more, right? And then if we look at a home he owns in Omaha, has a market value of just $500,000. The property taxes on that one are even higher than on the $2 million home in Laguna Beach. And so what we see is that this distortion really causes like a major headache in the real estate market. So let's think a little bit about how this plays out over time, right? Let's say somebody buys a home for $100,000 and they have their really low assessment rate locked in. The home appreciates in value, their appraised value, but their assessed value is held low. When they want to sell that house to move or to downsize, whatever their reason is, based on their stage in life, who's gonna buy that? Knowing that they are gonna have to then take on all that additional valuation growth and pay those property taxes. And sure, somebody goes in eyes wide open on something like that, maybe they're fine with that. But then the person selling that home also has to buy a new home. And they are gonna have trouble finding one that they wanna take on that valuation growth on. And so it creates this lock-in, lock-out effect that I think has been super critical to the pains we're seeing in the California housing market. Specifically, you're seeing population decline in California after decades of massive population expansion. But how nobody can get a house they can afford because of years of underbuilding and this distortion. The other one that I want to talk about today is Colorado's TABOR, or the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. Who's heard of that one? A few less people, but that's okay. I'm gonna tell you all about it today. So TABOR was adopted in 1992, sort of a break from that 1970s property tax bill. I think this was just a general tax revolt altogether. So this limits how much money can be spent or retained by the state government. Excess revenues are then distributed back to taxpayers as a sort of a dividend. Proponents of these kinds of policies applaud their check on government growth and argue that they democratize tax policy. But there's a downside to them to these as well. Super restrictive policies like TABOR ultimately tend to result in severely underfunded public services, because in cases like this, costs tend to rise faster than revenues are allowed to grow. And I think we see that a lot in the public sector. Costs to run a city or a county or a state tend to grow even faster than costs overall. And that's just sort of the way that it shakes out, unfortunately. And so when you restrict revenue severely, here's what happens. TABOR led to some severe negative impacts in Colorado in its first 10 to 12 years. Education spending as a percent of personal income fell sharply. Colorado had to actually suspend its childhood vaccination program briefly because it just couldn't afford the vaccines. The share of low-income children without insurance doubled from 1992 to 2005, despite increasing in the nation more broadly. And Colorado ultimately received a credit downgrade in 2002. California voters ultimately voted to suspend TABOR for 5 years in 2005, actually, to get their fiscal house back in order. Of course, that was made more complicated by a crushing economic recession just 3 years later. And to this day, Colorado remains the only state to have adopted a policy as restrictive as TABOR. Slide. So an alternative to these draconian tax expenditure limitations are circuit breakers. Most states have some form of circuit breaker. We have our homestead property tax credit, the safe senior credit, and some of these others that are, more recent in nature. But one state stands out above the rest, and we'll get to that state in just a minute. First, I want to talk about what circuit breakers are generally. Circuit breakers are tax credits meant to limit the share of income a target demographic spends on property taxes. They can come in a couple different forms. Some of them, want to look at the percent of income spent on property taxes and keep people under that percentage of their annual income. Others want to do a hard cap. You won't spend more than this amount on property taxes. There are a number of ways. That's one of the great things about them is they're very flexible in how they can be designed. These programs provide targeted relief to those most in need and have incredible flexibility in their design. As I just said, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. However, they can also become pretty expensive very quickly, and so that's sort of the drawback of these programs. Michigan is the gold standard in terms of circuit breaker programs, in my personal opinion. Qualifying individuals can claim a refund of up to $1,700 for 60% of income that exceeds 3.2% paid towards property tax. So let me try to say that another way. It's just a lot of numbers all at once. So if you pay more than 3.2% of your annual income on property taxes, you can claim a refund for up to 60% of that difference for a maximum of $1,700. That's generous. People with disabilities and low-income seniors can actually claim 100% of that difference between 3.2 and whatever they end up paying towards. It is still for that max of $1,700, which, you know, depending on your situation, may be a whole lot. If you have $1 million home, it might not be so much. Next slide. Renters are also included in this program. I think 23% of their rent as quote unquote property taxes, which sort of harkens back to when I said earlier that renters indirectly pay these taxes through higher rents. The eligibility for this credit phases out when how they designate it total household resources. It's essentially just total household income, whether it's individual, family, just however much is the total income. When that exceeds $67,300, eligibility for the credit is no longer eligible. And houses with a value greater than $154,400 are also ineligible. And these are adjusted annually for inflation. And now looking at that house value, you know, in today's market, that doesn't seem like a whole lot. But again, that's one of the really great things about circuit breaker programs is that they can be designed to fit the needs of a state. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm a huge proponent of these sorts of programs. I'd like to see, you know, the legislature take up this sort of programs, more broadly expand our existing program, make it a little more generous. I think that that could go a long way. And that's actually my last slide, but I have a little bit more that I'm going to sort of dig into here. So while circuit breakers are a great tool for getting money back to people, sustainably lower property taxes is only going to be achieved through rebalancing our housing market. Without more supply, valuations will continue their runaway growth, and property taxes will soar right along with them. So this is an issue that to solve in the long term is going to take cooperation at the local, state, and federal level. And it's also going to require the cooperation of residents. I mean, have any of you heard about NIMBYism? Mm-hmm. Not in my backyard. To an extent, I get it, right? But if we're serious about sustainably lower property taxes, we gotta build. We've been underinvesting in housing since the financial crisis. We overinvested for a few years before that, but now it's time the tides have turned, and if we don't get some more housing for people, then we're all going to continue to pay the price. And now we can do some questions. Get at what you really want to know.
So, the last paragraph, where you talk about the cap, Sherry, can you go back to that slide for everyone? This cap of, I think is what, 154,000 in Michigan?
Yeah.
The problem with Kansas is that people's home values can get up there, and that may not be at all what you pay for that house, but you get quicker, you get over that cap, but you're still struggling trying to pay the tax if you're a senior.
Sure.
So do you think there is the ability, hopefully, that they can try to look at those caps and raise them?
So, you know, I think there are a couple of opportunities there. You know, one, we can look at the median home value and then determine eligibility based on some level of that. So, you know, if you want to go 120% or 80% of the median home value, that's one option. Another option is that instead of looking at this from an appraised value, we could look at it from an assessed value. And, you know, if somebody's, so, I mean, if let's just say I want to try to make my math easy. If somebody's home's worth $300,000, their assessed value would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 33,000. And if we wanted to look at, say, somebody having an assessed value under 50,000, right? And then so only people with like really expensive homes aren't going to be getting this credit. That's another possibility. I think assessed value could work out pretty well.
Two-part question. You mentioned that you would like to see more homes built. Is that an indication that home ownership as a percentage is declining? And secondly, can you explain, it's related, but rent control that we hear so much about in concentrated urban areas?
Yeah, sure. So we have seen declining homeownership over time. Definitely as more people are looking for housing, more people have aged into that sort of stage in their lives, and we just don't have the housing to be bought. We've definitely seen an uptick in renters. What that's a factor of is hard to say, whether people are unable to afford a house or whether they're unable to find a house. So that is probably gonna be different based on even where you live. As for rent control, I mean, generally speaking, it's not economically advisable. Well, a lot of times what rent control can lead to is the proliferation of what are slumlords, where they just don't have incentive to upkeep the property because their rents are being artificially low. Are there some extreme cases where maybe that's not such a bad option, say with like New York City, where rent can easily get up into $3,000, $4,000 per month? That's tough to say. I'm glad I'm not running for mayor of New York. But I don't think that would be something that Kansas probably needs to look at. Instead, we could return renters back to the homestead credit, which they were in prior to the tax cuts back in 2015, around that era.
It is on. I got into a conversation the other day with somebody that says, that's trying to tell me that churches do pay a property tax. And we went from property taxes on churches, tax relief that they're not exempt, whatever, to the mega churches. You only touched on that very lightly, and this has come up in several conversations from my point of view. So what do you have to say on that?
Sure, so, yeah, churches are statutorily exempt from, I believe, all taxes, honestly, in the state, so property sales. And I mean, ostensibly, they don't have income in the same way that a for-profit company does. So they are exempt from property taxes, but as I said, this can get a little bit complicated because, say like those mega churches, as a good example, the enterprises that they own, they're sort of spun off companies, those might be subject to taxation. So if they are selling merchandise, say in their lobby, which would probably need to be separate from the actual church itself, that could be taxed, because at that point they are selling that merchandise to me. So depending on where the enterprise is located and what the enterprise is engaged in, churches can pay taxes on some of their deals.
But not on property as church itself.
Correct, the church itself would not pay property taxes.
Two questions. First, it seems like if you're paying a certain amount of tax and you're retired, your income does not come up. It remains the same. And they either raise the tax levy or they raise the value of the house. I don't know, what can we as silver-haired legislators, what can we recommend to our legislatures to help eliminate this raise of taxes, but not raise of income.
Sure, yeah, that's a tough one, right? I mean, I think that's what we're all trying to get at is what is the answer? And, you know, I mean, in the short term, I do think making our existing circuit breakers more generous, especially for people on a fixed income, that's gonna be the short-term solution. We're gonna want to see some of that. I mean, I really like the Michigan model. Unfortunately, it does get expensive. I think they spend about $350 million a year on their circuit breaker. Kansas might not have that kind of revenue, but again, this can be designed in such a way that if we could bring all of our existing programs into one, I think that would really help because then it's a more streamlined process as opposed to individuals having to go through and figure out which credit they qualify for, which credit would be best for them, and which credit they want to take advantage of ultimately. That's challenging. So getting it all into one streamlined process, making it more generous, those are two things we can do to help now. To help in the long term to prevent those valuation increases, again, we just need a bit larger supply of housing. I think that there's, you know, a lot of validity to sort of like those levy limits. It's not something I get into a whole bunch, but this is sort of a mechanism by which local governments are prevented from increasing their levies more than a certain amount. So it's a little bit less restrictive than, say, the assessment limits like California's.
Well, if we do that, we get that, is that gonna raise the taxes for everybody else to cover the payback?
It feasibly could, right? I mean, money doesn't come from nowhere, and I think that's why it's so important at this point that we look at expanding the tax base. And I don't necessarily mean just building new homes. I mean that we need to look at more creative methods of taxation. You know, sales taxes are pretty much topped out. I don't know anybody who wants to pay more sales taxes. Property taxes aren't too high. That's what we're talking about right here. And income taxes is something that has been just being chipped away at in recent years by the Kansas legislature. So what we need to look at probably is getting more creative with, say, excise taxes. One thought that I play around with is like a data collection tax. They have some model legislation in New York whereby companies pay based on a number of users whose data they harvest. And so that sort of acts as like both a disincentive to harvest the data and it's a good revenue raiser. So I think just getting creative like that and making sure that the burden isn't falling on low income families, fixed income seniors, and people who are already paying too much in taxes.
My representative tells me about something that I believe he calls Golden Years Act. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about the Golden Years property tax program. So that one is sort of like what this gentleman was talking about with how the valuations keep going up, the taxes keep going up. The Golden Years program acts as a sort of freeze and keeps your taxes from going up from year to year. So you have like your base year where you apply for it, and once approved, that becomes your max property taxes in future years. I'm not 100% sure ability criteria, but it is an excellent program, especially for low income, fixed income seniors. So definitely something worth looking into. And, you know, again, it's one of those things where we have all these programs, and so it's hard to know which ones to take.
People don't know.
Exactly. And I don't think the state government does a really good job of marketing itself. So.
Yeah, two questions. First one's kind of a simple response from you, I think. The county assessor is often boogeyman because they keep the properties going up, if that's what the study shows. If a person successfully appeals that, and in fact does it a couple times, if they sell their place later on, and it turns out that they were able to get a whole lot more money, in other words, the appraiser was probably correct, do they have to recover that property tax and pay the county, or did they just get off scot-free?
Yeah, so I mean, they're probably gonna get off scot-free with sales tax on that. But in terms of the property tax, no, I don't believe that there would be any sort of revenue recovery process in that case. If you if you succeeded on an appeal, I mean, that's case closed. And, you know, it should be with how arduous that appeal process is.
Okay, the other one though, all of the taxing units, when they have their yearly budget, they have to do this, revenue neutral or whatever. Can you explain that and how that works and more importantly, how that affects counties?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a revenue neutral statement in my bag. I should have brought it up here with me, knowing that I was gonna talk about property taxes. That revenue neutral stuff is, I don't know, it's sort of a misnomer in a way. Essentially how that works is that if an entity is planning to raise your property taxes more than is needed to maintain their previous year's funding levels, then they have to have a public comment period. And these statements are sort of difficult to decipher, and then you have to like have the time and the energy to want to go out to these public comment periods in the evening on a Wednesday or whatever. And then ultimately, it doesn't matter, it's a formality, right? It's just that they allow you that privilege, and then they'll take the vote, and more likely than not, they're going to go past that. So the revenue neutral is really good to stay aware, but in terms of teeth, there aren't really any.
My question is about disabled veterans. Other state has them, Texas has them. If you're 100% disabled, you don't pay property tax. And we're trying to get that here in Kansas, but I don't know what happened last time. I think she passed it, so something similar to that. But where are we on that?
Yeah, so disabled, 100% disabled veterans are treated differently in a lot of the circuit breakers that we have currently. They are able to very often take advantage of the same sort of benefits that like low income seniors are, for example. I believe that they have a carve out in the golden years property tax freeze that I was just talking about. So there are some options. But in terms of how robust those options are, it could be more, honestly. And I think there's a lot of focus on it in the legislature. I do. I think, at this point with, you know, looking out to 2028, the states in the red, finding any additional tax relief is gonna be a challenge without raising additional revenue.
Yeah, I have a question about 1031 exchanges. Could you talk about that?
I don't know I don't know, maybe you can give me a brief refresher, because I'm not sure.
What I'm not concerned about is the appraised value of homes in the Wichita area. We have people from the East Coast and the West Coast that form real estate investment trusts. And what they do is they accumulate money from people that are living in homes that are multi-million-dollar homes, putting the money in a trust, going into low value areas, which they would consider Wichita being, and buying up a bunch of homes and paying a lot more than people that really live there can afford to pay. And then all of a sudden, you got a guy from California buying 15 homes because he sold one home in California. And then he starts renting them out, keeps them for a few years, then he sells them, and all this is done to avoid paying capital gains tax. And it's kind of made our neighborhood sort of like weird. I know the houses that are appraised there aren't worth as much as they are, but that's what the appraiser says because of the homes that have been sold to these people. They're not a person, they're a real estate investment trust that was formed because of this thing called 1031 exchange, which I really don't know what it is. That's what they explained.
That's really helpful because, yeah, I didn't know the term myself, but I can speak a little bit to the practice though, and it's definitely predatory, I would say. Because this sort of stuff does not only drive up valuations, as you mentioned, because they'll pay above market. It also decreases the housing supply because once they pay above market, whether they're gonna flip it and then make another 50 grand on it, or whether they're gonna wanna rent it out, at some exorbitant rate that nobody can afford because they overpaid for it, it has a real impact. It's sort of, it's very distortionary. Not quite in the same ways as like Proposition 13, but this is a real problem that I think is going on not only in the residential space, but in commercial as well.
You mentioned earlier, there are basically three sources of taxes. There's sales tax, income tax, property tax. Would it not make more sense? And you mentioned about this as far as income tax is concerned, we keep lowering income tax. Isn't that the tax that is most suited to your ability to pay? And wouldn't that make sense? Because I don't think most people realize we have two tax brackets in Kansas. And it's at a household income at 46,000. It's below 46,000 and above 46,000. And then you have a rate for above 46,000. And it doesn't matter if you make 46,000 or you make 460,000. It's the same rate. Wouldn't that make more sense to have another bracket or two?
Yeah, you're exactly right. The income tax is what's known as a progressive tax. And that's not progressive in the sense of liberal or anything. It's progressive in the sense that as your income rises, your tax burden progresses. They progress together. Whereas some of these other taxes, especially sales, is known as a regressive tax because it impacts people on the lower end of the income spectrum more. And so, yeah, the income tax is heavily tethered to your ability to pay. And as Mr. Smith just said, it doesn't matter if you're making $4 million or $46,000, you're paying the same rate in Kansas. And as of this last legislative session, we're actually on sort of a glide path to a flat tax. And that's not only for personal income, that's also corporate income. So once the goal is achieved there, it's a formulaic thing. I don't know how long it's going to take, but at the end of the day, once it's achieved, everyone in this room who pays income tax will be paying the exact same amount in income tax as, say, Walmart in Kansas. So we pretty much tied our hands with the income tax because any extra revenue that we gain from income tax is going to be used to buy down that rate for years to come. So that's problematic.
One more and then we're gonna have to wrap it up.
Sounds good. I'll get out of the hot seat.
I had two questions. What about reevaluation of how agricultural land is taxed? And secondly, utilities. Because it seems to me utilities are a monopoly. And they're not gonna leave the state if we increase the tax. So I understand to say, well, they'll just turn around and increase the tax to the consumer, which I get that. But maybe people won't recognize this much as a new property taxes.
Yeah. So I think that with property taxes, it's one of those that's just really visible to people. So I think to your point, people might not notice the rate, although this last one kind of irritated a few people. But yeah, I mean, utilities are a publicly allowable monopoly, government sanctioned monopoly. And so that is a good option for raising revenue. As far as revaluation of agricultural land, I'm not an expert in agricultural taxation. That's a weird formula, but I do know that Representative Adam Smith introduced last session a bill to sort of apply a similar methodology to residential and commercial property in the sense that they would use a rolling average, the lesser of rolling average or fair market value to determine. So I think that could smooth things out. We gave neutral testimony on that, and I think it would have been great. I just wanted to see the number of years put into the statute so that the legislature couldn't mess around with it in future years.
Nathan, thank you. Thank you very much. Tomorrow morning, he will be at the Capitol building, talking again. Write your questions down. I'll corner him for you, and you can put him on the hot seat again.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Here's your thumb drive. Here's your thumb drive.
Okay. We finally got to the end of today. Well, not quite. I'm going to turn the microphone over in a little bit to Katie.
She said she had about 45 minutes that she wanted to talk and that's good. No, I guess not, okay. Let me do some announcements first here. Let me go through some of these first. Okay, try to get you acquainted with the booklet that you have in front of you and what's going on tomorrow. Where you need to go, what you need to be doing and how we're gonna handle things. In Salida this year, we talked about starting the station at 9 o'clock instead of 8 o'clock. So we're doing it at 9 o'clock, but that makes us a little tight on tomorrow morning. So we're gonna cut back on some of the stuff that we do normally in the State House.